I sipped my morning coffee, savoring the rich aroma as I stared at the blank canvas before me. The cursor blinked incessantly, mocking my inability to find inspiration. Little did I know that my life was about to be shattered into a million pieces. "Maya, we need to talk," Brandon said, his tone grave. I turned to face him, his expression sending a chill down my spine. "What's wrong?" He took a deep breath. "I found someone else. I want a divorce." The words hit me like a freight train, knocking the air from my lungs. "What do you mean you've found someone else? We just celebrated our anniversary." Brandon's gaze was unwavering. "It's not working between us, Maya. I've moved on." Tears welled in my eyes as the harsh reality set in. The man I loved, the one I thought I knew better than anyone, had betrayed me in the cruelest way possible. "How could you do this to me? To us?" He shrugged, his indifference like a slap across my face. "It just happened. I'm sorry, but I have to follow my heart." I wanted to scream, to hurl insults at him, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I collapsed onto the couch, sobs racking my body. The life I had so carefully built with Brandon was crumbling before my eyes. As the days passed, the pain only intensified. Brandon's coldness was like a dagger to my heart, his lack of remorse adding insult to injury. I found myself obsessively scouring our finances, searching for any clue that could explain his sudden betrayal. That's when I uncovered the truth. A trail of credit card receipts and bank statements that painted a sordid picture. Expensive gifts, lavish hotel stays, and unexplained transactions littered the pages. Brandon had been living a double life, and I was determined to uncover every sordid detail. I pored over the financial records, my hands trembling as I uncovered the extent of Brandon's deceit. Extravagant purchases, pricey hotel stays, and unexplained cash withdrawals littered the statements. It was clear he had been living a double life, and I was determined to uncover every sordid detail. As the evidence mounted, my suspicions grew stronger. Brandon's late nights at the office and sudden business trips that once seemed innocuous now took on a sinister hue. I needed answers, and I knew just the person who could help me find them. Thomas Gray, a private investigator with a reputation for discretion, agreed to take on my case. Within days, he provided me with a dossier that shattered what little remained of my trust in Brandon. "Your husband has been seeing a woman named Emily Harper," Thomas revealed, his voice grave. "He's been spending lavishly on her, fancy dinners, expensive jewelry, you name it." I felt sick to my stomach as Thomas outlined the sordid details of Brandon's affair. The scale of his betrayal was far greater than I had ever imagined. "There's more," Thomas continued. "I've uncovered evidence that suggests Brandon has been embezzling funds from his company to finance his lifestyle with Emily." A wave of nausea swept over me. Not only had Brandon cheated on me, but he had also stooped to illegal means to fund his indiscretions. The man I had once loved was a complete stranger to me. Anger coursed through my veins, a burning desire for revenge igniting within me. Brandon had destroyed our marriage and jeopardized his career. And for what? A fling with some young girl? He would pay dearly for his actions, and I knew exactly how to make him suffer. With a steely resolve, I formulated a plan. I would gather every shred of evidence, every damning detail, and present it to Brandon's boss and colleagues. His sordid affair and illegal activities would be exposed for all to see, and he would face the consequences of his actions. As I plotted my revenge, a sense of calm washed over me. For too long, Brandon had held the power, but now the tables had turned. He had underestimated me, and he would soon learn the true depths of my fury. With the evidence in hand, I knew it was time to confront Brandon about his betrayal. I steeled myself for the inevitable confrontation, determined to expose the truth and make him face the consequences of his actions. When Brandon arrived home that evening, I was waiting for him in the living room, the damning financial records and private investigator's report laid out on the coffee table. "We need to talk," I said, my voice trembling with barely contained fury. Brandon's eyes narrowed as he took in the scene before him. "What's all this?" I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "It's over, Brandon. I know everything." His bravado faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't play dumb with me," I spat, shoving the financial records in his face. "The credit card statements, the hotel receipts, I've seen it all. You've been having an affair with some woman named Emily Harper." Brandon's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, his gaze defiant. "And that's not even the worst of it," I continued, brandishing the private investigator's report. "You've been embezzling funds from your company to finance your little fling. How could you do this, Brandon? How could you throw away everything we had for a cheap thrill?" His eyes hardened, and he let out a derisive laugh. "You think you know everything, but you don't have a clue." I recoiled at the venom in his voice, a wave of disgust washing over me. "I was miserable with you, Maya," he sneered. "You were always so caught up in your work, never giving me the attention I deserved. Emily made me feel alive again." His words stung like a slap to the face, but I refused to let him see how deeply they cut. "And as for the money," he continued, "I deserved it. All those long hours, all the sacrifices I made for that company, they owed me." I shook my head in disbelief, my heart shattering at the depths of his selfishness and greed. "You're a monster, Brandon. A pathetic, delusional monster." His lips curled into a cruel smile. "Maybe, but at least I had the guts to go after what I wanted. You were always too weak, too afraid to take risks." In that moment, any lingering affection I had for Brandon disappeared, replaced by a cold, burning hatred. He had destroyed our marriage and everything we had built together, all for his own selfish desires. And for that, he would pay dearly. As Brandon turned and walked away, I vowed to make him suffer the consequences of his actions. He thought he had won, but he had no idea what was in store for him. The game was just beginning, and I intended to emerge victorious, no matter the cost. After the explosive confrontation with Brandon, I found myself consumed by a burning desire for revenge. His callous betrayal and utter lack of remorse had left me reeling, but I refused to let him get away with his despicable actions. With the help of Thomas Gray, the private investigator, I delved deeper into Brandon's sordid affairs. The evidence we uncovered was damning, a paper trail of financial misdeeds that painted a picture of a man consumed by greed and selfishness. "He's been funneling funds from his company to support his lavish lifestyle with Emily," Thomas revealed, his expression grim. "It's not just a few thousand here and there. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars." I felt sick to my stomach as the full extent of Brandon's crimes came into focus. He had not only betrayed me on a personal level, but had also betrayed the trust of his employer and colleagues. "There's more," Thomas added, sliding a folder across the table. "I've uncovered evidence that suggests Brandon has been involved in other illegal activities at his workplace. Kickbacks, insider trading, you name it." As I pored over the documents, a sense of determination washed over me. Brandon had dug his own grave, and I intended to bury him in it. With the incriminating evidence in hand, I set my plan in motion. I scheduled a meeting with Brandon's boss, Mr. Davis, and the company's HR manager, Jessica Lang. It was time to bring Brandon's house of cards crashing down around him. The look on Brandon's face when he walked into the conference room was priceless. His cocky demeanor quickly faded as he realized the trap I had set. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his eyes darting between Mr. Davis and Jessica. I stepped forward, clutching the folder containing the damning evidence. "It's time for you to face the consequences of your actions, Brandon." With a steely resolve, I laid out the details of his misdeeds, the embezzlement, the illicit affairs, the flagrant abuse of his position. Brandon's face grew paler with each revelation, his once confident facade crumbling before our eyes. "Is this true?" Mr. Davis demanded, his voice trembling with barely contained fury. Brandon opened his mouth to protest, but the words died on his lips. He knew there was no denying the mountain of evidence against him. "You're finished, Brandon," I declared, savoring the taste of victory. "Your career, your reputation, it's all over." As Brandon was escorted from the building, his head hung in shame, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. He had brought this upon himself, and now he would face the consequences of his actions. The first phase of my revenge was complete, but I wasn't finished yet. Emily Harper, the woman who had so willingly participated in Brandon's betrayal, would soon learn that her part in this sordid affair was far from over. The look on Brandon's face as he was escorted from the building was priceless, a mixture of shame, disbelief, and utter humiliation. But my revenge was far from over. Emily Harper, the woman who had so willingly participated in his betrayal, would soon learn that her role in this sordid affair was far from over. I had planned every detail meticulously, ensuring that Brandon's downfall would be as public and devastating as possible. With the help of Thomas Gray, the private investigator, I had gathered enough evidence to bury them both. The next phase of my plan involved a grand spectacle, a confrontation that would leave no doubt in anyone's mind about the depths of Brandon and Emily's deception. I arranged for Emily to meet me at an upscale restaurant under the pretense of discussing a potential job opportunity. Unsuspecting, she arrived right on time, her bright smile quickly fading when she saw the icy expression on my face. "Maya? What's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. I gestured for her to sit, my lips curling into a cold smile. "I think it's time we had a little chat, Emily." Her brow furrowed in confusion, but she took the seat across from me, her eyes wary. "I know everything," I stated, my voice low and even. "I know about your affair with Brandon, and I know about the money he's been funneling to you." Emily's eyes widened, panic spreading across her features. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, her hands trembling. "Don't bother lying," I snapped, sliding a file across the table. "I have all the evidence right here, bank statements, hotel receipts, the works." Emily's face drained of color as she flipped through the damning documents. "Brandon's been embezzling funds from his company to support your little fling," I continued, relishing the sight of her discomfort. "And you little homewrecker, were more than happy to take advantage of it." Emily opened her mouth to protest, but I cut her off with a wave of my hand. "Save it," I hissed. "You had your chance to come clean, but you chose to stick by Brandon's side, even after you knew the truth." Emily's eyes darted around the restaurant, her panic mounting as she realized the scene I had orchestrated. Waiters, patrons, and even Brandon's former colleagues were all watching, their faces a mix of shock and disgust. "So now, you get to face the consequences of your actions," I declared, my voice ringing out across the room. "Just like Brandon, you're going to lose everything, your reputation, your freedom, everything." Emily's shoulders slumped, defeated. She knew there was no escape, no way to talk her way out of this. "I hope it was worth it," I spat, leaning closer, "because this is just the beginning of your punishment." As I turned and walked away, I couldn't help but savor the sweet taste of victory. Brandon and Emily had thought they could betray me and get away with it, but they had underestimated my resolve. Their lives were in ruins, and they had no one to blame but themselves. The weight of revenge had been lifted from my shoulders, replaced by a sense of newfound freedom. I was finally free to move on, to rebuild my life without the burden of their betrayal weighing me down. And as for Brandon and Emily, well, they had made their bed, and now they would have to lie in it, together, if they were lucky. With Brandon and Emily's sordid affair now exposed, it was time to take the final steps in my revenge plan. I had orchestrated their public humiliation, but they still needed to face the legal consequences of their actions. I scheduled a meeting with Mr. Davis, Brandon's former boss, and Jessica Lang, the HR manager. As I walked into the conference room, the tension was palpable. Brandon and Emily were already seated, their faces etched with dread. "Thank you all for being here," I began, my voice calm and steady. "I know the past few weeks have been tumultuous, to say the least." Brandon shot me a venomous glare, but I ignored him, focusing my attention on Mr. Davis and Jessica. "As you're both aware, I've uncovered substantial evidence of Brandon's illegal activities, embezzlement, fraud, you name it," I stated, sliding the thick file across the table. "He's been siphoning funds from the company to finance his lavish lifestyle with Emily." Mr. Davis's face grew red with anger as he flipped through the documents, his jaw clenched tightly. "This is absolutely unacceptable," he growled, slamming the file shut. "Brandon, you're fired, effective immediately, and we'll be pursuing legal action against you to the fullest extent of the law." Brandon opened his mouth to protest, but Mr. Davis silenced him with a stern glare. "Don't bother trying to deny it," he snapped. "The evidence is overwhelming. You've disgraced this company and betrayed our trust in the worst possible way." Emily squirmed in her seat, her eyes darting nervously between Brandon and me. "And you," Mr. Davis continued, turning his attention to her, "you're just as complicit in this mess. Did you really think there wouldn't be consequences for your actions?" Emily's bottom lip trembled, but but she remained silent. Her head hung in shame. Maya has given us the option to handle this internally, Jessica chimed in. But if you don't cooperate fully, we'll have no choice but to involve the authorities. Emily's eyes widened in fear, and I couldn't help but feel a twinge of satisfaction. She had thought she could ride Brandon's coattails to a life of luxury, but now she was facing the harsh reality of her choices. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I leaned forward, my gaze unwavering. "The truth, every sordid detail of your affair with Brandon and your involvement in his illegal activities." Emily swallowed hard, her hands trembling slightly. "If you cooperate fully," I continued, "we might be able to mitigate the legal consequences. But if you lie or hold anything back, you'll face the full wrath of the law." A heavy silence hung in the air as Emily considered her options. She knew she had no choice but to comply. The weight of the evidence against her was too great. "Okay," she whispered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll tell you everything." As Emily began to recount the sordid tale of her affair with Brandon, I couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. They had thought they could betray me and get away with it, but, in the end, karma had caught up with them. Their lives were in ruins, and they had no one to blame but themselves. As for me, I was finally free from the burden of their betrayal, and free to move forward with a newfound sense of strength and resilience. With Brandon's world crumbling around him, I knew it was time to deal the final blow to the woman who had so willingly participated in his betrayal, Emily Harper. I arranged to meet her at a secluded cafe, away from prying eyes. When she arrived, her face was pale and drawn, the weight of her misdeeds clearly weighing heavily upon her. "Maya," she began, her voice trembling, "I don't know what else to say except I'm sorry. I never meant for things to spiral so out of control." I regarded her coolly, my anger simmering just beneath the surface. "Do you really expect me to believe that? You knew exactly what you were doing from the start." Emily flinched at the venom in my voice, her eyes downcast. "You're right," she whispered. "I knew Brandon was married and I didn't care. I was selfish and stupid, and now I'm paying the price." "You have no idea the depth of the price you'll pay," I hissed, leaning forward. "Brandon's life is in ruins, thanks to your little fling, his career, his reputation, all of it gone. And you're next." Emily's eyes widened with fear, her hands trembling. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I know everything," I stated, sliding a thick folder across the table. "Every sordid detail of your involvement in Brandon's illegal activities. The money laundering, the fraud, it's all there, in black and white." Emily's face drained of color as she flipped through the damning evidence, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. "No, this can't be happening," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Oh, but it is," I replied, my voice laced with satisfaction. "You thought you could play the innocent victim, but you're just as guilty as Brandon, maybe even more so." Emily's shoulders slumped, defeated. She knew there was no way out, no escape from the consequences of her actions. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice trembling. I regarded her coolly, my mind already made up. "The truth. Every last detail of your involvement in Brandon's illegal activities. If you cooperate fully and tell me everything, I might be able to help you avoid the worst of the legal consequences." Emily's eyes widened, a glimmer of hope flickering across her face. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll tell you everything." For the next hour, Emily spilled her guts, recounting the sordid tale of her affair with Brandon and her complicity in his illegal activities. As the details poured out, I couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment when Emily would finally face the consequences of her actions. When she finished, her voice hoarse and her eyes brimming with tears, I regarded her with a cold, steely gaze. "Thank you for your cooperation," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "But make no mistake. You've brought this upon yourself. You made your bed, and now you have to lie in it." As I turned and walked away, leaving Emily to face the fallout of her decisions, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. The weight of revenge had been lifted from my shoulders, replaced by a newfound sense of freedom and strength. I was finally free to move on with my life, to leave the pain and betrayal of the past behind me. And as for Brandon and Emily, well, they would have to learn to live with the consequences of their actions. just as I had learned to live with the consequences of mine. In the aftermath of my confrontation with Emily, a sense of calm washed over me. For months, I had been consumed by anger, bitterness, and a burning desire for revenge. But now, with Brandon and Emily's lives in ruins, I felt a weight lifted from my shoulders. It hadn't been easy, of course. The initial shock of Brandon's betrayal had hit me like a ton of bricks, leaving me reeling and questioning everything I thought I knew about our marriage. The nights spent poring over financial records and piecing together the sordid details of his affair with Emily had taken their toll, both emotionally and mentally. But through it all, I had remained resolute, driven by a steely determination to expose the truth and make them pay for their misdeeds. And in the end, I had emerged victorious, my revenge served cold and calculated. Brandon's world had crumbled around him, his career and reputation in tatters. The once powerful executive was now a shell of his former self, facing legal action and financial ruin. And Emily, the woman who had so willingly participated in his betrayal, had been left abandoned and facing her own set of legal consequences. As for me, I was finally free. Free from the burden of their lies, free from the weight of their betrayal. It was time to move forward, to rebuild my life on my own terms. In the months that followed, I threw myself into my work, channeling my newfound energy and focus into my freelance graphic design business. Projects that had once felt like a chore now filled me with a sense of purpose and accomplishment. I also rediscovered old hobbies and interests that had fallen by the wayside during my marriage. I took up painting, losing myself in the vibrant colors and the therapeutic act of creating something beautiful from a blank canvas. Slowly but surely, I began to heal, the scars of Brandon's betrayal fading into the background. Of course, there were still moments when the pain would resurface, when the memories of our life together would come flooding back. But with each passing day, those moments became fewer and farther between. As I stood on the edge of a cliff, overlooking the vast expanse of the ocean, I couldn't help but feel a sense of wonder and possibility. The world was my oyster, and I was ready to embrace whatever came next. "This is just the beginning," I whispered to myself, a small smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. "I'm ready for the next chapter of my life." And with that, I turned and walked away, leaving the past behind me and stepping boldly into the future, a future that was mine, and mine alone, to shape and mold as I saw fit. For too long I had been defined by Brandon's actions and the pain of his betrayal. But now I was free to forge my own path, to write my own story. And this time, there would be no room for deception or heartbreak, only growth, self-discovery, and the unbridled joy of living life on my own terms. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, I couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for the lessons I had learned, the strength I had found within myself. The road ahead might be uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I felt truly alive, ready to embrace whatever challenges and adventures lay ahead. I was standing in the kitchen, the phone pressed against my ear, disbelief washing over me in cold waves. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Harper, your mother passed away." The voice on the other end, a doctor from Chicago General Hospital, sounded distant, like a faint echo in a long, empty hallway. "My mother?" I murmured, my voice barely a whisper. The room spun, and I gripped the countertop for support. Last week, we had talked about her coming over for Thanksgiving. She was fine then. How could this be? I had to tell Martin. He had been working in Europe for the past 3 months, and communication had been sparse, but he needed to know. I dialed his number, my hands trembling. After several rings, he answered. "Martin, it's Elaine. My mom, she passed away." There was a pause, and then his voice, devoid of warmth, came through. "Oh, I see. Look, Elaine, I'm really tied up right now. I've got a trip planned with the guys to Barcelona. Can't really skip it." His words hit me like a physical blow. "You're not coming back? Not even for the funeral?" I struggled to keep my voice steady. "Elaine, you know how it is with my job. I'll be back in a couple of months. Just handle things there, okay?" And without waiting for my response, he hung up. I stood there, the phone still in my hand, feeling a hollow emptiness growing inside me. My mother was gone, and the man I had spent 20 years with couldn't care less. The next few days passed in a blur of arrangements and condolences, a relentless march of reality that I navigated like a ghost. It was on the third day, in the midst of this, that I received another call that seemed to stop time altogether. It was Martin's brother, Alex. "Elaine, there's been an accident. Mom and Dad, they're gone." The phone slipped from my grasp and clattered to the floor. Martin's parents, too? It felt like some cruel joke, a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I called Martin, but his phone went straight to voicemail. I left message after message, each one more desperate than the last. I couldn't go to his parents' funeral. Without Martin, I was just an outsider, a reminder of the son who couldn't be bothered to show up. The thought of their empty seats, an unspoken accusation in the air, was unbearable. As the days passed, I found myself sitting alone in the house we had built together, surrounded by memories that now seemed like lies. I thought back to how we met, introduced by our fathers who were old college friends. It had felt like a fairy tale then, our families joining together in a bond of love and friendship. But as the years went by, the fairy tale had slowly faded. Martin was always busy, always absent. His work was his life, and I, along with our son Peter, were just fixtures in his world. When Peter was 10, my father passed away. My rock, my confidant, gone. Martin had been away on a business trip then, too. I was left alone to deal with the grief, to support our son, to keep the family together. And now, with both our families shattered, I was alone again. Our marriage had become a routine of loneliness and resentment. I was the homemaker, the silent supporter, while Martin was the absent provider. But was he really providing, or just running away from a life he no longer wanted? I tried to remember the last time we had laughed together or shared a moment of genuine connection. But all I could see was the growing distance between us, a chasm filled with unspoken words and unmet needs. As I sat there, lost in my thoughts, I realized that this wasn't just about his absence. It was about the lack of respect, the lack of empathy. It was about a marriage that had become a hollow shell of what it once was. And as the sun set, casting long shadows across the room, I knew that something had to change. I couldn't live in this shadow any longer. The days following the funerals were a whirlwind of silent houses and unanswered calls. I tried to reach Martin again, but it was as if he had vanished off the face of the earth. That's when the memories began to creep in, unwelcome and unbidden. I remembered our early days, how Martin's charm and ambition had swept me off my feet. We were young, in love, and the world seemed full of possibilities. But as years passed, the man I fell in love with started to fade, replaced by someone consumed by work and his own needs. I was pulled from my reverie by a knock on the door. Standing there was Alex, Martin's younger brother. His eyes were red-rimmed, his usual cheerful demeanor nowhere in sight. "Elaine, I can't believe he didn't show up. Not even a call," he said, his voice heavy with grief and disbelief. "I know, Alex. I've been trying to reach him, but—" Nothing. Alex shook his head, his anger palpable. "You know, Elaine, there's something deeply wrong with him. Mom and Dad deserved better. You deserve better." His words struck a chord in me. Deserve better. The thought had crossed my mind, but hearing it from someone else made it real. It wasn't just me feeling this way. "Elaine, if you need anything, just let me know, okay?" Alex offered before he left, a hint of worry in his eyes. That night, as I lay in bed, the house eerily quiet, I realized how much of my life I had dedicated to a man who saw me as nothing more than a convenience. The love, the support, the sacrifices, it was as if they meant nothing to him. A mixture of anger and resolve began to build within me. I wasn't going to be the silent, suffering wife anymore. I needed to find out what Martin was up to, what was so important that he couldn't even show up for his own parents' funeral. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. I hired a private investigator. It was a drastic step, but I needed to know the truth. The PI was a middle-aged woman named Sarah, who had a no-nonsense air about her. "We'll find out what he's up to," Sarah assured me. "It won't take long." True to her word, within a week, Sarah came back with information that shattered any illusions I had left about Martin. Photos and reports of him with another woman in Barcelona, looking carefree and in love. As I looked at the photos, a cold, hard knot formed in my stomach. This wasn't just a business trip. This was a betrayal of everything our marriage was supposed to stand for. I confronted Martin over the phone. His response was a cocktail of excuses and deflections. Elaine, you're blowing this out of proportion. It's just a work thing. A work thing? Is that what you call this? I countered, my voice shaking with anger. You wouldn't understand. It's complicated, he snapped back, his voice cold and distant. I realized then that I was speaking to a stranger. The man I had married, the man I had built a life with, was gone. In his place was someone who saw me as nothing more than a hurdle to his desires. That night, as I lay awake, the weight of my decision heavy on my chest, I knew there was no going back. Martin had made his choice, and now it was time for me to make mine. The path ahead was unclear, but one thing was certain. I would no longer be a prisoner in my own life. The days after discovering Martin's betrayal were a blur of anger and disillusionment. Each morning, I awoke to the stark reality of my solitary struggle. The house, once filled with laughter and warmth, now echoed with the silence of betrayal. I busied myself with the mundane tasks of daily life, but my mind was elsewhere, consumed with thoughts of Martin's deceit. The images from the investigator's report haunted me, a constant reminder of his infidelity. One evening, as I was going through old photo albums, a picture of our wedding day caught my eye. We looked so happy, so in love. I couldn't help but wonder where it had all gone wrong. Was it gradual, or had there been a specific moment when Martin decided I was no longer enough for him? My train of thought was interrupted by a call from Peter, our son. "Hey, Mom, how are you holding up?" "I'm managing, Peter," I replied, trying to sound stronger than I felt. There was a pause before he spoke again, his voice laced with concern. "Mom, I've been thinking. Maybe I should come home for a while, help you through this." His offer touched me deeply, but I couldn't let him put his life on hold for me. "No, Peter, you need to focus on your studies. I'll be fine." But Peter was insistent. "Mom, this isn't just about you. Dad's actions affect me too. I need to be there for you." His determination was a balm to my wounded heart. Despite Martin's absence, Peter had grown into a caring and responsible young man. His support gave me strength, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel so alone. A few days later, Peter arrived. His presence filled the house with a much-needed energy. We spent hours talking, sharing our thoughts and feelings about Martin and the situation at hand. "It's just so selfish, Mom. How could Dad do this to us?" Peter's anger mirrored my own. "I don't know, Peter, but I do know that we can't let his actions destroy us. We're stronger than that." As we talked, a plan began to form in my mind. Martin had taken so much from us, it was time he understood the consequences of his actions. I wasn't going to be the silent victim anymore. It was time for Martin to face the music. The following week, I met with a lawyer to discuss the possibility of divorce. The lawyer, a stern-faced woman named Mrs. Hammond, listened intently as I recounted the events of the past few weeks. "Mrs. Harper, based on what you've told me, you have a strong case for divorce, especially with the evidence of infidelity," she said, her tone professional yet empathetic. I nodded, a mix of relief and apprehension washing over me. This was really happening. I was taking the first step towards freeing myself from Martin's shadow. As I left Mrs. Hammond's office, a newfound sense of purpose filled me. I was no longer the woman who waited silently for her husband to return. I was Elaine Harper, and I was going to take control of my life. But as I stood there looking out at the bustling city streets, a part of me couldn't help but mourn the loss of the life I thought I had. The happy family, the loving husband, it was all an illusion, shattered by the harsh light of reality. As I headed home, I knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Martin had underestimated me for the last time. The revelation of Martin's affair had set a fire within me, one that burned with the need for justice and retribution. As I sat in our living room, the walls seemed to close in on me, each family portrait a reminder of the facade our life had become. My resolve was tested one evening when Martin called. His voice, once familiar and comforting, now grated on my nerves. "Elaine, I've been thinking. Maybe I was too harsh. We should talk when I get back." His words, meant to soothe, only fueled my anger. "Talk? After everything you've done? You abandoned your family, Martin." "Elaine, you're overreacting. It's not like I planned this. Things just happened," he replied, his tone dismissive, as if his betrayal was a mere inconvenience. "Things just happened. You make it sound like you had no choice in the matter. You chose to be with another woman. You chose to ignore your own parents' funeral." There was silence on the other end, and for a moment I thought he had hung up. Then he spoke, his voice cold. "I don't have time for this, Elaine. I have important work here." That was the last straw. "Important work? Is that what you call abandoning your family? You know what, Martin? Maybe it's time I made some important decisions of my own." I hung up before he could respond. My hands were shaking, but my mind was clear. It was time for action. The next day, I met with Sarah, the private investigator. "We need more evidence, anything that can help in the divorce proceedings," I told her, my voice firm. Sarah nodded, understanding the assignment. "I'll see what I can dig up. Martin won't know what hit him." Over the next few weeks, Sarah provided me with a steady stream of evidence. Photos, emails, and even testimonies from people who had seen Martin with his mistress. It was more than enough to paint a clear picture of his infidelity. Armed with this information, I met with Mrs. Hammond again. She reviewed the evidence, her expression grim. "This will certainly help your case, Mrs. Harper. It seems Mr. Harper has been quite careless." As we discussed the next steps, a plan began to take shape. Martin had always been proud of his reputation, both personally and professionally. It was time to use that against him. "Mrs. Hammond, I want to make sure Martin feels the consequences of his actions, not just legally, but personally and professionally as well." Mrs. Hammond regarded me with a new level of respect. "I understand, Mrs. Harper. We'll make sure he gets what he deserves." When Martin finally returned home, it was to a cold and unwelcoming house. I greeted him with divorce papers, my expression as hard as the resolve within me. "Elaine, what is this?" he asked, his voice a mix of surprise and annoyance. "It's over, Martin. I'm filing for divorce, and before you try to talk your way out of this, know that I have enough evidence to ruin you." Martin's face turned a shade paler, his usual confident demeanor crumbling. "You wouldn't dare," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I dare, Martin. I dare to stand up for myself and for our son. You've made your choices, and now you'll live with the consequences." As he read through the papers, his face twisted in anger and disbelief. But there was no going back. I had drawn the line, and there was no crossing it. That night, as Martin packed his bags and left, I felt a sense of liberation. The chains of our loveless marriage were finally broken. I was free to start anew, free from the lies and deceit that had bound me for so long. As I watched him drive away, a sense of justice filled me. This was just the beginning. Martin would soon learn that his actions had consequences that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The days following Martin's departure were filled with a tumultuous mix of emotions. Anger, relief, and a sense of vindication swirled within me. The house, now void of his presence, felt larger, as if it too had been holding its breath under his oppressive shadow. My resolve was tested when I received a call from Martin, his tone a mix of anger and desperation. "Elaine, you're ruining me. The divorce papers, the allegations. Do you realize what you're doing?" His words were like fuel to my fire. "Yes, Martin, I know exactly what I'm doing. I'm showing the world who you really are." "You can't do this to me. I've worked hard for everything I have," he argued, his voice laced with entitlement. "Worked hard? You mean you've lied and cheated your way through our marriage? You've made your bed, Martin. Now you have to lie in it." Martin's voice rose, a crescendo of frustration and disbelief. "You were nothing before me. You think you can just take everything?" I felt a surge of power at his words. "I was nothing? No, Martin. I was everything you didn't appreciate. And now I'm taking back what's mine." The call ended with Martin's threats echoing in my ears, but they no longer held any power over me. I was done being the victim. As the divorce proceedings began, Martin's true nature became evident for all to see. His attempts to hide assets and slander me only served to damage his reputation further. The evidence Sarah had gathered painted a clear picture of his deceit and infidelity. The court hearings were tense, with Martin's lawyers trying every trick in the book. But Mrs. Hammond was a force to be reckoned with, countering their moves with precision and finesse. Throughout it all, Peter stood by my side, his support unwavering. He had grown disillusioned with his father, the truth eroding any semblance of respect he once held. The day the divorce was finalized was a day of liberation. As the judge declared our marriage dissolved, a weight lifted from my shoulders. I had won, not just the divorce, but my freedom from Martin's shadow. After the court session, Martin approached me, a shell of the man he once was. "Elaine, please, we can still fix this." I looked at him, really looked at him, and what I saw was a man broken by his own arrogance. "There's nothing left to fix, Martin. You broke everything worth saving." Walking away from him, I felt a chapter of my life closing. The pain, the betrayal, the lies, they were all behind me now. Ahead lay a path of my own making, free from the deceit that had clouded my life for so long. As I stepped out of the courthouse, the sun broke through the clouds, bathing the world in a warm golden light. It felt like a sign, a promise of new beginnings and brighter days ahead. I turned to Peter, a smile spreading across my face. "Let's go home, son. We have a new life to start." And with that, we walked away, leaving Martin and the past where they belonged, behind us. With the divorce finalized, I was determined to reveal the extent of Martin's disgrace to those who had been blinded by his facade. I knew that true justice wouldn't come from the courts alone. It had to come from exposing him to the world. I started by reaching out to our mutual friends, people who had known us as a couple for years. The initial reactions were mixed, with some refusing to believe the truth, but I had evidence, undeniable proof of his infidelity and deceit. Slowly but surely, the tide began to turn. One evening, I invited a few friends over, people who had doubted me initially. As they sat in my living room, I showed them the messages and pictures Sarah had gathered. Shock and disbelief filled the room as they saw Martin's true colors laid bare. One friend, Lisa, shook her head in disbelief. "I can't believe I defended him all this time. He's a monster." Tears welled up in my eyes as I nodded. "He fooled us all, but now you know." Lisa was the first to take action. She contacted others in our social circle, sharing the evidence and urging them to reconsider their alliances. Soon, the once seemingly impenetrable wall of support around Martin began to crumble. One by one, our friends distanced themselves from him, appalled by his actions. The same people who had once admired him now saw him for what he was, a selfish, deceitful man who had no regard for anyone but himself. As Martin's social standing crumbled, he became increasingly isolated. His attempts to salvage his reputation only made things worse, as he lashed out at those who had abandoned him. His once strong network of contacts began to disappear, leaving him with no one to turn to. I watched with a sense of grim satisfaction as the man who had caused me so much pain faced the consequences of his actions. It wasn't enough for him to lose his friends. I wanted him to lose everything. One day, I received a call from Martin's former boss, Mr. Reynolds. He had heard about the divorce and the scandal surrounding Martin. "Elaine, I had no idea. I can't believe he would do such things." I sighed, my voice heavy with exhaustion. "It's been a long time coming, Mr. Reynolds. Martin's true nature finally caught up with him." Mr. Reynolds paused, then spoke with a hint of regret. "I'm sorry to hear about all of this, but I wanted to let you know that Martin's behavior at the company has also come to light. We've decided to terminate his employment." I felt a rush of vindication. "Thank you, Mr. Reynolds. It's about time he faced the consequences." As the news of Martin's termination spread, his world crumbled further. He had lost his job, his friends, and his reputation. It was a fall from grace that he couldn't recover from. But I wasn't done yet. I had one final move to make, one that would ensure Martin paid for his actions in the most significant way possible. With Martin's world in shambles, it was time for the final blow, the ultimate revenge that would ensure he paid for his sins. I had discovered a hidden secret during the divorce proceedings, one that would bring him to his knees. Late one evening, as I sat in my quiet home, I made the call I had been dreading but also eagerly anticipating. The voice on the other end was familiar, cold, and detached. "Martin, we need to talk." There was a long pause before he replied, his voice wary. "What do you want, Elaine?" "I want justice, Martin. I want you to pay for everything you've done." My words were deliberate, each one carrying the weight of my anger and determination. Martin chuckled, a mocking sound that sent shivers down my spine. "You think you can do anything to me now? I've lost it all, Elaine. What more could you possibly take from me?" I took a deep breath, steadying myself. I know about your hidden accounts, Martin, the offshore ones you thought were safe. I have the evidence, and I'm not afraid to expose you. Silence hung in the air, thick and suffocating. I could hear the panic in his voice when he finally responded. How did you? That's not important right now, I interrupted. What matters is that I have the power to ruin you completely. The authorities will be very interested in those accounts, Martin. His voice trembled as he spoke, desperation creeping in. What do you want, Elaine? Money? Is that what this is about? I couldn't help but laugh. A bitter and vindictive sound. Money won't fix the damage you've done, Martin, but it will ensure you suffer for a long time. I outlined my terms, a substantial portion of his hidden wealth to be transferred to me as compensation for the years of pain and betrayal. Martin had no choice but to agree, his voice defeated. As I hung up the phone, I felt a rush of satisfaction. Martin had lost everything, his job, his reputation, and now his secret wealth. He was a broken man, a shadow of his former self. But I had won. I had taken back control of my life, exposed him for the monster he was, and ensured that he would pay for his actions. It was a sweet victory, one that had been a long time coming. In the end, it wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming my own dignity and self-worth. I had emerged from the darkness stronger and more resilient than ever. As I sat alone in my quiet home, I couldn't help but smile. The nightmare was finally over, and I was free to live my life on my terms. Martin's downfall was a satisfying end to a chapter of my life that I was more than ready to leave behind.